It's 2023. A Western diplomat stands at a podium in Geneva. He's lecturing China about human rights, about the rule of law, about respecting international norms. And somewhere in Beijing, a Chinese official is watching. And he's not angry. He's almost amused, because he knows something that diplomat either forgot or never learned. The government that diplomat represents, it fought wars to sell drugs to China. It burned palaces. It carved up Chinese territory. It wrote treaties at gunpoint and called it diplomacy. And now it lectures about norms. Here's what your education never explained. China doesn't reject Western principles. China questions the credibility of the people delivering them. And when you understand the history, the real history, you'll understand why. You've watched this tension your whole life. The accusations, the defensive responses. China bringing up ancient history that Western commentators dismiss. But what if that history isn't ancient to China? What if it's the reason they don't take the lectures seriously? Let me show you what I mean. Every year, China receives the same sermon from Western capitals. You've heard it. The State Department issues reports. Parliament holds hearings. The EU passes resolutions. The talking points never change. Human rights. Western governments say China violates them. They demand accountability. They impose sanctions. Democracy. Western leaders say China needs it. They fund programs to promote it. They criticize the one-party system. Rule of law. Western diplomats say China lacks it. Courts aren't independent enough. Property rights aren't protected enough. Contracts aren't honored enough. Free trade. Western economists say China cheats. Subsidies are unfair. Market access isn't reciprocal. Intellectual property gets stolen. International norms. Western officials say China breaks them in the South China Sea, in Taiwan policy, in how it treats its neighbors. These lectures come from Washington, London, Brussels, Canberra, Ottawa. The same capitals, the same language, the same moral certainty. And China's response? Increasingly, who are you to lecture us? Not a deflection, a genuine question, because Chinese officials know a history that Western publics often don't. Let's talk about what your textbooks probably skipped. The human rights lecturers were drug dealers. Britain didn't just trade with China. Britain ran the largest drug trafficking operation in human history. Parliamentary records from the 1830s, Britain's own documents, show the strategy clearly. Grow opium in India, smuggle it into China, create millions of addicts, use the profits to buy tea. By 1838, estimates ranged from 4 to 12 million Chinese opium addicts. Even the conservative number is staggering. That's not a trade policy. That's a public health catastrophe, engineered deliberately by a foreign government for profit. And when China tried to stop it? When Chinese officials seized and destroyed British opium in 1839, Britain declared war. They called it defending free trade. They won. They forced China to legalize the drug trade, pay reparations, and hand over Hong Kong. That's the first Opium War. Your history class probably spent 5 minutes on it. In China, every child learns the details. The democracy promoters were colonial occupiers. The same Western powers lecturing China about self-governance spent a century denying China any. After the Opium Wars, Western nations carved out concession zones in Chinese cities, territory where Chinese law didn't apply. Shanghai had areas where signs read, "No dogs or Chinese allowed." That's not legend. Contemporary photographs exist. Western powers didn't bring democracy to China. They brought extraterritoriality, a legal system where Westerners in China answered only to Western courts. Chinese people had no vote, no representation, no rights in parts of their own country. The rule of law advocates wrote treaties at gunpoint. Between 1842 and 1943, Western powers forced China to sign 23 major, unequal treaties. The Treaty of Nanking, the Treaty of Tientsin, the Convention of Peking. Each one signed after military defeat, each one stripping Chinese sovereignty. These weren't negotiations, they were dictations. Sign this, or we burn more cities. Accept these terms, or we keep fighting. The rule of law meant Western powers make the rules, China follows them. Lord Elgin, the British commander who burned China's Summer Palace in 1860, wrote in his own letters that he wanted to leave a solemn act of retribution that would be felt at Peking. That's not diplomacy. That's terrorism in formal language. The free trade advocates plundered wealth. Western powers didn't trade with China as equals. They extracted. The Boxer Protocol of 1901, still in archives, still readable today, demanded 450 million taels of silver in reparations. That's roughly $333 million in 1901 dollars. Adjusted for today, tens of billions. But here's the part that really matters. That sum was over 1,300% of China's annual tax revenue at the time. China was forced to take foreign loans to pay foreign powers for the privilege of being invaded by those same foreign powers. The interest payments lasted until 1939. China was still paying off the debt when Japan invaded. The international norms enforcers invaded as an alliance. In 1900, 8 nations, Britain, France, the United States, Germany, Russia, Japan, Italy, and Austria-Hungary, sent troops to Beijing. 50,000 foreign soldiers occupied the Chinese capital. They looted, they killed. Contemporary accounts from Western soldiers describe the chaos. American troops were there. This isn't distant European history. The U.S. was part of the 8-nation alliance that occupied Beijing, imposed massive reparations, and stationed foreign troops in China for decades afterward. 8 of the world's most powerful nations ganged up on one, and they called it restoring order. Now let's do something uncomfortable. Let's match the lectures to the lecturers. Britain lectures China about human rights. Britain, whose government ran the opium trade that created 12 million addicts, whose military burned the Summer Palace, destroying 800 acres of irreplaceable cultural heritage, whose empire held Hong Kong for 156 years without ever letting residents vote for their own leader. When British officials criticize Chinese human rights, Chinese officials think, you're lecturing us after what you did. America lectures China about international norms. America, whose troops were part of the 8-nation alliance invasion, whose government supported Chiang Kai-shek's regime during the Civil War, whose military bases still surround China today. When American officials invoke international norms, Chinese officials hear, your norms, written when you had the power. Now that we're rising, suddenly the rules are sacred. The EU lectures China about the rule of law. France burned the Summer Palace alongside Britain. Germany demanded territorial concessions in Shandong. European powers carved China into spheres of influence. Actual maps divided China like a pie. When European officials invoke rule of law, Chinese officials remember your laws, imposed by your gunboats, for your benefit. This isn't ancient grudge holding. This is pattern recognition. The same nations, the same language, different century, similar dynamic. Chinese Foreign Ministry responses often reference this history. Western media usually frames it as playing the victim card, or whataboutism. But that misses the point entirely. China's argument isn't, we can do whatever we want because you did bad things. China's argument is, your credibility to lecture us is questionable given what you did and never acknowledged. There's a difference. When Chinese officials bring up the opium wars in response to human rights criticism, they're not changing the subject. They're questioning the moral authority of the critic. They're saying, you want to establish international norms? Fine. Start by acknowledging you violated them catastrophically when you were powerful and China was weak. This matters because credibility matters in international relations. Lectures land differently depending on who delivers them. If a reformed criminal counsels against crime, that carries weight. If an active criminal lectures others while continuing to offend, that's different. From China's perspective, Western powers never did the first part. There's been no "we were wrong" moment, no historical reckoning, no adjustment of the narrative that still calls the opium wars opening China to trade, instead of forcing drugs on China at gunpoint. British history textbooks, Julia Lovell has written about this, traditionally devoted more time to the burning of the Summer Palace's architecture than to why Britain invaded. The aesthetic loss, not the moral crime. American education barely mentions the Eight-Nation Alliance. Most Americans don't know U.S. troops occupied Beijing in 1900. Chinese officials notice this. They notice what gets taught and what gets skipped. They notice which atrocities get memorialized and which get minimized. This isn't an impossible situation. Credibility can be rebuilt, but it requires something Western governments haven't offered: acknowledgement. Not apology tourism, not empty gestures, actual historical honesty. Imagine if British education taught the opium wars the way Chinese education does, as a drug-dealing operation backed by military force. Imagine American curricula covering the Eight-Nation Alliance invasion with the same detail as the Boxer Rebellion that preceded it. Imagine Western leaders, before lecturing China, acknowledging, our governments did terrible things to China. We destroyed your property. We humiliated your nation. We profited from your suffering. That history doesn't excuse present violations, but it does explain why our lectures might not land the way we intend. That would change something. That would establish a different foundation. Instead, the pattern continues. Western governments lecture, China points to history. Western media calls it deflection. Chinese media calls it hypocrisy exposure. The conversation goes nowhere. And here's what really gets to the heart of it. China isn't asking the West to self-flagellate forever. They're asking for consistency. When Western governments criticize Chinese actions in Xinjiang, Chinese officials point to Iraq. Not because Iraq reveals selective outrage. 1 million Iraqis dead based on false pretenses, and the politicians responsible face no international court, no sanctions. Some get library dedications. The argument isn't Iraq makes Xinjiang okay. The argument is your principles appear situational. You invoke human rights when it serves your interests. You ignore violations when you commit them. Credibility gap. That's what Chinese officials call it. And from their perspective, it's vast. You've watched this dynamic your whole life. Western governments lecturing China, China pushing back, each side talking past the other. Now you understand the historical weight. Western governments lecture China about human rights. The same governments that forced opium on millions and never apologized. They lecture about the rule of law. The same powers that wrote unequal treaties at gunpoint and called it civilization. They lecture about democracy, the same nations that ran colonial concessions where Chinese people had no vote in their own cities. They lecture about international norms, the same alliance that invaded Beijing with 50,000 troops and made China pay for the privilege of being occupied. China doesn't reject these principles. Chinese officials say they want human rights, rule of law, fair trade. What they reject is the presumption that nations with this track record have unquestionable moral authority to judge. When you understand the history, you understand the skepticism. That's not dismissing all criticism. That's questioning who has standing to make it. The officials who drafted the Opium War treaties are gone. The soldiers who burned the Summer Palace are dead. But the governments remain. The institutions continue. And the historical record sits in Western archives documenting exactly what happened. China remembers. They teach it. Every generation. The question isn't whether China should accept criticism of its current behavior. Every government should face scrutiny. The question is whether the critics have done the work to establish credibility, whether they've acknowledged their own history, whether they've applied their principles consistently. Until then, the lectures will keep coming, and China will keep pointing to history. And Western audiences will keep being told that's whataboutism. But you know the context now. You understand what Chinese officials are actually saying. Not, our problems don't matter, but your credibility does.